I always got along well with one of my cousins, Cole, who was the same age as me. The two of us were inseparable, always getting along and often found together both at school and outside of school when we were 12 years old and in 6th grade. I was hanging out with Cole on a Friday afternoon around the end of May, and we were excited for the weekend. We ended up at his house because he didn't live too far from me. At some point, my mom called to inform us that our grandfather was in the hospital, though his condition wasn't expected to be life-threatening. He was staying overnight for observation, and both my parents and Cole's parents planned to stay with him and our grandmother at the hospital. I was told I could stay at Cole's house that night with his 15-year-old brother, Hunter, who was responsible while our parents were out. This was fine with us. I got along well with Hunter, and he was never the bossy older brother type. Some of my other friends said they had to put up with siblings ordering them around, but we ordered pizza and enjoyed playing with his younger siblings, who were around 9 or so. There was a knock on the front door, and Cole went to answer it. I was somewhat curious about who it might be at that time of night, so I peeked from behind the door. They were two older people. They said they were from the city and were investigating reports of poor water pressure in the neighborhood. They asked Cole if his parents were home, and when Cole said they weren't, that's when we were told to tell strangers if our parents weren't home. The people then started asking a lot of questions about the water pressure inside the house, and if they could come in to check. Hunter came over at that moment and politely told them that the water pressure was fine, and that they might want to move on to check other houses in the neighborhood. They seemed reluctant to leave, but eventually they turned away and left, after Hunter started closing the door. After they left, we looked at each other and shrugged, but none of us really thought too much about it afterward, and we went back to doing what we were doing. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. Cole and Hunter shared a room, and we all agreed that I would sleep there with them, rather than crashing on the couch or something, so we could chat as we fell asleep. Hunter grabbed a sleeping bag from their camping gear for me, and when we got back to the bedroom, we all wore our underwear and cut-off pajamas. Then they got into their beds, and I crawled into the sleeping bag. After chatting for a bit about random things, we all eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up because I had to pee, so I quietly got out of my sleeping bag and went and did my business in the bathroom. On my way back to the bedroom, I heard something in the living room, which was at the other end of the house from the bedroom, specifically the bathroom I had used. I didn't pay much attention at the time, assuming it was probably Cole or Hunter, until I got back to the bedroom and realized they were both still there, trying not to panic. I woke them up and told them I thought there was someone in the house. They silently followed me, and as we entered the family room, we saw the two people from the night before there, and it was pretty clear they were robbing the place. One of them started moving towards us as he pulled out a menacing-looking knife. The three of us immediately ran to the front door somehow and managed to get it unlocked and open just in time, and we fled outside. Luckily, a police car was passing by at that moment, so we quickly flagged it down and told the officer about the two people in the house. The police requested backup, and within a few minutes, several more officers were there, and they began searching the house. They apprehended the two individuals. The police determined that the two had definitely entered through the window in the laundry room, which had a faulty latch, and they might have targeted this house specifically because they knew we, the kids, were alone. They might have thought that if we found them, we'd be easier to deal with than adults, which would add insult to injury. While we were waiting outside while the police searched the house, some neighbors came out to see what was happening, including some kids who went to the same school as me, including some who were in the 6th grade with us. It was at that moment that the three of us realized we had never had the chance to dress for our worst stereotype nightmare, having to stand outside in front of everyone wearing just our underwear for what felt like forever, before being allowed back in. When we returned to school on Monday, Cole and I had to endure more than just laughter and being the butt of every joke for the next few weeks until school ended for the summer. One night when I was 14 years old, I was at my friend Jared's house. He's my best friend, and I often go there. My parents knew I was there, but Jared's parents didn't know. My parents were out for the night, so we could do whatever we wanted. Of course, being kids, we stayed up all night playing Call of Duty in Jared's living room. Jared had a TV and gaming setup in his own bedroom, but his dad had just bought a new TV twice the size of Jared's, so we were excited to move the Xbox out there and just play in the living room. Jared asked me if I wanted to stay overnight. I had already thought that's what I was doing, so I was confused. I asked him if I should be there, and he just shrugged and said no. I sighed and decided to go along with it. A few hours passed, and we started to get tired. So Jared grabbed some blankets and 2 pillows for both of us. We decided to sleep upstairs in his room, so we played around for a bit before finally falling asleep. I'm a light sleeper, so it wasn't surprising when I woke up to the sound of music playing outside. I looked out and saw a car parked in the driveway. I thought it might be Jared's mom and dad, but when I woke Jared up, he told me it clearly wasn't and couldn't be one of their cars. The car was still running, but it seemed like there was no one inside. We tiptoed downstairs and found the front door wide open. At that point, my hair stood on end, and I knew we were really in trouble. Jared's room was far on the left side of the house, and was the last door on the left in the hallway, as we turned to go back to his room to grab our phones so we could call for help. But as we passed the bathroom, someone grabbed Jared and started running away. I swear I've never felt so scared in my life. Instead of grabbing my phone, I turned back and started chasing the guy. We were running through the living room, and Jared was struggling to get away from him, and the man started to get away from me. Then, as I ran out the front door down the stairs, I saw a creepy green and brown van parked on the side of the road in front of the house, and that's when I knew I had to do something fast before something life-changing happened. I grabbed a shovel that luckily was lying on the front yard near the flower bed, apparently left by Jared's dad outside unintentionally, and I managed to grab it in my embrace. Far from them, and I hit the man right in the side of the leg with all my might. They both immediately fell to the ground, and I helped Jared to his feet, and we ran back inside, and the man drove off in his van. The neighbors, seeing some commotion, had already called the police, and they arrived shortly after. As for the other car that was in the driveway, we're still not sure what it was. They told me it was a false alarm, and maybe he was cold or something and went out early. Or maybe he had nothing to do with it at all and it was purely coincidence. But I doubt the police will ever find either of the 2 suspects. And going to Jared's house since that day has felt weird to say the least. My name is Jonathan, and I'm 21 years old, and all of this happened when I was 16. What happened to my friend and me still haunts me and makes me afraid to talk about it even to this day. I was sleeping over at a friend's house one night. It was a Wednesday, and school was canceled early for the next day. I lived in Colorado when we were hit by a pretty crazy snowstorm in the winter, and this was one of those nights when the roads were so bad that school called for a snow day, so I was really glad to be staying at my friend Tyler's house. And we were just as happy as any 16-year-olds would be about not having school. Luckily, he lived in the same neighborhood as me, so all I had to do was pack my overnight bag and walk over there. It was only about a 5-minute walk, so it wasn't really a big deal. Of course, our parents had to work the next morning, so we would have the house to ourselves all day. The next day, we stayed up all night playing video games and goofing around, talking about the most random things you can imagine that teenage boys would talk about. Nothing weird happened that night. It was a normal night, but the next day is when things went sideways. I'd say it was around 11 o'clock in the morning. Tyler was making a sandwich in the kitchen, and I was using the bathroom when suddenly the doorbell rang. We both heard it loud and clear. Although at first we were scared, we weren't too worried about it. We lived in a relatively safe area, and bad things like home invasions and stuff like that almost never happened here. Tyler even made a joke about it possibly being Jehovah's Witnesses or something. I ran out of the bathroom and Tyler and I walked to the front door, and I told him if there's anyone out there, please help me. I'm in serious trouble right now. Our neighborhood is very quiet, and it's highly unlikely for someone to knock on our door. It's not something that happens often. Tyler looked out to try and see who it was, and it definitely wasn't Jehovah's Witnesses. With a guy wearing shorts and a t-shirt, he had short black hair and was probably about 5'10". "What's going on? Who are you?" I asked Tyler, not hitting my shoulder. He was clearly annoyed with me for letting ourselves be known. Music. Looking back, I really wished I didn't say anything because maybe the guy would have left and all this wouldn't have happened at all. Clearly not the smartest move on my part. I admit the guy outside then started banging on the door and pleading for us to let him in. We knew something was wrong, so obviously we didn't let him in. We ran downstairs and hid in the secret spot in the basement that Tyler showed me. He called his mom to let her know, and his mom said she was on her way home. Luckily, Macy Tyler's mom only worked about 5 minutes from home, so she would be there soon after Tyler hung up the phone. Even though we heard footsteps coming up, we knew it couldn't be his mom. "Buddy, what are we gonna do?" Tyler said. I told him that we just have to stay calm and wait it out, buddy. "Are you kidding me? What?" Tyler said. "All right, what do you suggest?" We did. Then I asked anything but sitting here, we have to run. He said, "I don't know how good of an idea that is, but I'm not going to sit here and hide alone." So I followed. We opened the door so slowly and walked through the basement towards the window we would try. I didn't understand how it works, but I knew it was the best option in reality. I raised both of my hands so I could give him a boost, and Tyler managed to open the window. He struggled for a minute, but eventually he could get outside. What about me? I thought in my heart. It's true when Tyler told me to grab the wooden coffee table in front of me and use it as a jumping stool to lift me up. Then he would pull me out. I jumped, and Tyler grabbed my arm and pulled with all his might. And somehow, I managed to get through the window and out as well. I had to catch my breath because I was panicking so hard that we didn't even realize the man was standing right behind us. He looked at us with the most unsettling stare you could imagine. He was a very strange person. Both of us ran towards the front of the house, and ironically, Tyler's mom was pulling into the driveway just as we reached the end of the driveway. The man followed us, but quickly ran the other way when he saw that we were with an adult Tyler's mom. He called the police, and we found out that the man was a fugitive who had just escaped from jail less than 24 hours before. The police showed us a photo of the man, and Tyler and I both confirmed to the officers that it was the same person if they catch him later that night, and now he's in jail, and maybe a long-term convicted sex offender, and likes to attack young boys, and specifically boys our age. He definitely had been stalking us and knew we were alone. It makes me sick how messed up some people are. I always enjoy having a house to myself. It gives me a sense of freedom and independence that I rarely experience when my parents are around. At that time, I was 18 years old, and my parents were on a short business trip. I was alone at home that night, sitting on the sofa browsing my phone when I heard a creaking sound. I stopped to listen carefully, but there was nothing else. I tried to ignore it as just settling house noises, but being alone made it hard to shake off the creepy feeling. I decided to distract myself by watching TV. I clicked on a random show and settled back on the sofa, but as I watched, I kept feeling like someone was standing behind me. I would quickly turn around each time, but there was nobody there, just an empty room with a flickering TV casting shadows on the walls. After about an hour of feeling uneasy, I decided I just needed to look around to reassure myself that I was safe. I turned off the TV and walked upstairs. There was nothing there, just an empty hallway leading to the bedrooms. I went into each room to look around. Nothing was amiss, and there was nobody in any of the rooms. I stepped back into the hallway and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was acting like a scared little kid for being too afraid of anything. I walked back downstairs and started descending the stairs when I reached the bottom. I turned into the living room, but from the corner of my eye, I saw something in the hallway. I stepped back and squinted to look at the front. The door was wide open. My heart stopped and I couldn't breathe as I stared at the door. Honestly, I'm not sure if I remembered to lock the door, but anyway, I never heard it open. I didn't know if there was someone inside the house, or if they had already left, or where they were in general. I stayed still and walked along the hallway towards the door. I stepped onto the porch and quickly glanced around before closing the door and locking it almost frantically. From afar, I heard the sound of the floor creaking from the other side of the house. It wasn't like someone walking, but maybe hiding. I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the far end of the room without seeing anything, but as I stood there, I heard a very faint breathing sound coming from behind the kitchen island. Someone was crouching, hiding just a few meters in front of me. Music. I ran out the front door, dialing 911 as I continued down the sidewalk. When the police arrived, they found no one inside, even though someone had clearly entered and walked around both downstairs and upstairs. They found shoe prints on the carpet upstairs that matched those found in the kitchen. What scared me the most was knowing that they had entered while I was at home, perhaps seeing me on the sofa while watching TV. I didn't know what their intentions were. Maybe they were just crazy people with no intentions at all. But even to this day, I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder when I'm alone, laughing. I work unusual shifts at my job, usually starting at 4 in the morning and ending at 4 in the afternoon. When I get off, I go home and immediately sleep for 8 hours, then wake up around 9 in the evening and stay awake until work. I prefer waking up in the following hours. I thought it was just another work day, and I arrived home and slept as usual at 10. I woke up, made some food, did some housework, and at 1 in the morning, I decided to take a walk before work. I do this almost every day before work just to keep my body awake. I put on a thin jacket and went outside. My neighborhood is always quiet and peaceful at these times. That's why I enjoy being awake at these moments. Sometimes it feels like I have the whole world to myself. As I turned onto the small road that passes through the preserved area of my neighborhood, the road was lit by dim lights along the sides as I walked. I saw a figure sitting on the bench underneath. He was quite far away when I first noticed him, maybe 2 or 3 minutes before I got close. But as I got closer, he was still there. I thought he was a jogger, taking a brief rest or something. If not, I didn't know why he was there. As I passed by, he stared at me. I smiled to show I was friendly, but he just stared and didn't say anything, which didn't make me feel any better. So I picked up my pace and planned to turn onto the next path about a quarter mile down. Just a few seconds later, another man came from a corner ahead of me and started walking towards me. I turned my head and saw the man on the bench now also walking towards me. I took a few more steps while my mind raced thinking about what to do. I wasn't sure if this was some kind of trap, but ultimately, I didn't want to take any chances. I veered into the trees and walked fast enough until I forgot about them once I turned off the path. Even though I heard the footsteps of the two men, I ran until I walked quite far into the woods, then settled my breath next to a tree while looking around. I could see both men standing at the edge of the road looking towards me. I took it as a sign that they were working together, so I kept walking through the forest until I found myself on the other side of the neighborhood. I made it home safely, and even went to work right after. I didn't immediately call the police because I wasn't sure if it was really a trap or not. But the more I thought about the men standing together looking into the woods, I decided it was best to call the police just in case. A month later, a woman from my neighborhood was kidnapped while out for a morning walk. I don't know if it was those men or if there was any connection at all, but I had a bad feeling in my heart that I would soon disappear. This happened when I was 16 years old. I worked at a coffee shop 3 nights a week after school. The place is very small and only has 3 or 4 tables, but it's open until 11 on weekdays. I had been there for about 3 months and was starting to get to know the frequent customers. It was a small shop, so it was actually rarer to see new customers. Anyway, one of the frequent customers was a man who introduced himself to me as the future Owen every day. Around 10 o'clock, ordered a small coffee and sat at the table for 15 to 20 minutes on his laptop, then leaves. We sometimes make small talk, and he tells me he's working all night and needs coffee to stay awake. I never let conversations go on for too long because I didn't feel comfortable sharing personal details about myself with older men when I was only 16 years old. One night, though, Owen ordered the usual, but when he got his coffee, he told me I looked really cute today. I smiled and said thank you. But inside, I felt so disgusted I was also the only one closer, so was alone in the shop with him. It was a bit uncomfortable. He left soon after. But the next day, I asked one of my coworkers about Owen. He was closed on the other days of the week when I wasn't working, so I assumed he would know exactly who he was, and probably know if he was creepy or no. But he said he didn't know who he was, even after describing it. He didn't know Owen had told me that he came every weekday before his night shift, but now I know that he only comes on the days I work. He left at 9 that night, and I was really worried. I spent the next hour trying to calm down, and told myself that it was all in my head. I was in the back storage room organizing shelves when I heard a bell near the door. I took a deep breath and prepared myself to act naturally, but just as I stepped towards the door leading to the service in the area, the door opened. I was shocked and stopped in my tracks. Owen was standing there holding the door open just to make sure you were okay, he said, smiling at me. Then he stepped back and let the door close. The door was behind the desk, so he had to go to the area special employee just to check on me. 10 seconds after entering the store, something was wrong, especially with the others. I was thinking. I walked out to the cashier where she was standing. She then ordered and went to her table while I made her coffee. I could felt him watching me from the other side of the room. The feeling was very strong, and when I turned his head, his eyes were already on me. I handed him the cup, and he thanked me profusely. Then he sat down and took out his laptop. It was 10:15, so I started my usual cleaning routine. But at 10:45, I realized that Owen was still at the table he always leaves at 10:30, but he seemed to just be waiting there. I waited until 11.055 minutes after we technically closed, before I packed up my things and walked over there. I told him the shop was closed and I needed to lock the door. He smiled and said yes, then stood up, but he didn't leave. He waited for me to step out and open the door for him. Owen was standing right next to me, basically breathing. My back as I locked the door. Good night. I said, turn around and walk quickly to my car. I pulled out of the parking lot and felt an overwhelming feeling of relief, but a few minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. They followed me through a few turns, and finally into my neighborhood, fearing the worst. I continued driving in random directions and called the police. I told them my suspicions and described the vehicle. The officer told me to continue driving through the neighborhood, and an officer would be there shortly thereafter, even though the car stopped and turned down. Different streets in the neighborhood, I was still taking random turns for 10 minutes before I realized I was fine and walking to my house when I turned onto the street. Even though I was horrified, there was a police car in front of my house. And likewise, the car that was following me turned out to be Owen, who I was sure of. But I didn't think he already knew where I lived. I was really lucky that night because if I hadn't called the police, I would have most likely been kidnapped, or maybe worse. It scared me to think that he might have followed me home weeks earlier and maybe even tried to peek through my window or something, I don't know. But I was happy. It is all over. On July 6th, 2018, Angela Hernandez woke up and found herself trapped inside her SUV, which was floating in the Pacific Ocean. She didn't remember how she got there or what had happened. Angela would spend the next 7 days clinging to her life. On that same day, just a few minutes before, Angela was driving along the California Coast Highway heading south. It was a relatively pleasant day, and her journey was leisurely with beautiful ocean views. She remembered most of the trip up until the moment she saw an animal running onto the road. Her instant reaction was to swerve, but as she tried to regain control, her SUV skidded off the cliff edge, plummeting 200 feet down before crashing into the rocky shoreline and then into the sea. After some time unconscious, Angela woke up, realizing she was still inside the car and could feel water rising up to her knees. She looked around and saw the electricity in her car was out and the windows were closed. Quickly, Angela grabbed a multi-tool from her side and began hitting it against the window. Every bone in her body felt immense pain, but even then, she didn't realize the extent of her injuries. When she finally broke the window, she pulled herself out and swam to the rocky shore where she immediately passed out. When Angela woke up, it was still daytime, and she began to realize the situation she was in. The cliff where she had fallen was not in a high-traffic area, but rather an isolated rocky beach with no way to climb the steep terrain. The cliff seemed to continue endlessly as far as she could see. In the distance, she saw her SUV stranded on the rocks with its roof torn off. Despite its dire condition, Angela started walking along the rocks to seek help, wearing nothing but socks. She could hear cars passing on the road above, but she was too far for anyone on the road to see her, and the road was too loud for anyone to hear her screams. She slept on the rocks due to hunger, thirst, and sunburn, and the next day authorities were alerted. Angela's whereabouts were unknown, and a small search team was sent to look for her. They got confirmation of Angela driving her SUV on the highway the day before, so that's where they started their search. Unfortunately, thick fog from the coast persisted for several days, making it nearly impossible for the rescue team to locate her or the wreckage. However, right beneath them, 200 feet below, Angela struggled for her life in critical condition. She spent the next 6 days using a hose she salvaged from her car to catch dripping water from the mossy rocks on the cliffside, while only getting a few drops at a time. All of this was counted in the situation. During these few days, she helplessly watched from the rocks as cars passed right near her on the highway. On Friday the 13th, Chad and Chelsea, a married couple, were walking along the beach exploring the area, which had never been visited by anyone. At some point in the afternoon, one of the hikers saw a car bumper floating along the shore. As they approached, they saw the crash site. The SUV was completely destroyed, and they had no idea how long it had been there. They saw no signs of anyone. Convinced that anyone inside the vehicle wouldn't have survived and likely been swept into the sea, Chelsea persuaded her husband to check the bodies in the area just to make sure. In their search, she spotted a woman among some partially submerged rocks. They both ran to Angela, giving her water and asking for help. First responders quickly arrived, rappelling down the cliff with ropes to treat her injuries before hoisting her back up and taking her to the hospital. At the time of her rescue, Angela suffered from brain bleeding, a broken collarbone and ribs, collapsed lungs, and other injuries. Fortunately, Angela was able to make a full recovery after the incident. Jimmy Hale was a relatively wealthy man living in Massachusetts in the early 1900s. In 1928, he began developing an interest in archaeology and fossils. After reading books on bushcraft and archaeology, he traveled to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas without hesitation, despite Mr. Hale lacking much preparation, considering himself an expert after a brief introduction through several books. Upon arrival, he hired a local landlord to provide him with temporary accommodation along with some guidance in the mountains. This individual was Vance Randolph, an experienced artifact hunter in the Ozark region, which was a common area for prehistoric archaeology. Vance stated that in the days leading up to their expedition, Mr. Hale felt very confident that he would even try to correct Vance based on his knowledge over the years. Despite starting their journey, they set up a small camp along their trail where they would stay and attempt to find artifacts and fossils. After 2 weeks of traveling across the Ozark Mountains, according to Vance, they were only 3 to 4 miles from the nearest village. On this morning at the camp, Mr. Hale decided he wanted to find this village so he could make a call to his girlfriend back home. He planned to walk to the small village and return a few hours before sunset. Vance stated that the road to the village was straight and safe and allowed Mr. Hale to go. Vance took this as a break from dealing with Mr. Hale's annoying arrogance and confidence. But when the sun began to set, Mr. Hale had not returned yet. The companions still couldn't believe Mr. Hale could get lost in the woods during the short trip, and instead believed he must have decided to stay overnight in the village. Vance waited for a while, then slept alone in the camp. In the morning, he waited until noon before realizing Mr. Hale should have been back by then. Vance went to the village and found no trace of Mr. Hale having been there the night before, which meant he had never made it to the village. More worried than ever, Vance enlisted the help of a local woodcutter named Lem, who knew the area even better than Vance himself. After just an hour of searching, they found a small cave. It was only 2 miles from their camp, and inside they found some of Mr. Hale's backpack belongings, confirming that he had slept there the previous night. The cave entrance was quite far from the village trail, which only made them more unsure of Mr. Hale's condition. Lem and Vance continued climbing the mountain towards the camp, thinking he must be trying to return. Not long after they saw Mr. Hale, when Vince approached him, Mr. Hale shook his head and waved his hand wildly. When Vance called to him, he turned and stared as if threatened. He then attacked Vance, foaming at the mouth and spitting with rage in his eyes. Vance ran and ducked behind bushes, using them to keep a distance from Mr. Hale as they circled him. After a short chase, Mr. Hale ran in the opposite direction, completely off the trail and into the dense forest. Lem followed his tracks and soon found Mr. Hale lying face down on the snow-covered ground. They approached cautiously, but found Mr. Hale completely unresponsive. Lem helped Vance carry Mr. Hale's limp body back to the village where Lem kindly allowed him to stay overnight. The next morning, Mr. Hale finally woke up when questioned. He seemed confused and stated that he only remembered a few things he said, which were being lost and crossing his own trail, then suddenly becoming very scared and running into the woods. That's all he could remember from the days before. He didn't remember what made him afraid or why he acted so aggressively. When Mr. Hale was better, he was sent home to Massachusetts. Whatever happened to Mr. Hale on his expedition in the Ozark Mountains is still unknown. In 2010, Edward Rosenthal embarked on a small journey into the remote desert of Southern California. Unbeknownst to him, Rosenthal would spend the next 6 days and walk a total of 39 kilometers completely lost in the vast and scorching sand desert canyons without any food or water. Edward Rosenthal was a true poet, a real estate broker, and an experienced hiker at the age of 64. He even kept a personal journal with records of his lifelong hikes. In 2010, Rosenthal contributed to a large-scale real estate sale in downtown Los Angeles, and to celebrate this significant achievement, he decided to take a trip to Joshua Tree National Park in California to spend a few days camping and hiking. Rosenthal stayed at the nearest hotel, and on Friday morning, he went to Black Rock Campground, where he would talk to some campers who were also staying there, and then embark on a short day-long journey into the canyons. He brought a framed hiking hat, 3 liters of water, some light snacks, a small blanket, a whistle, and some matches. Considering the small trail he followed, Rosenthal was actually well prepared. He managed to reach the end of the trail in just 1 minute. However, hours later, when he started walking back along the same trail, it's worth noting that the desert landscape often looked very bare, sometimes appearing almost the same in every direction. Without being too cautious, it would be very easy to think you were on the same trail when you were actually on a completely different one. Rosenthal remained on the right trail for a while, but after not recognizing some areas, he eventually realized he had lost the trail. He wasn't sure he could trace his way back to the trail given the unfamiliar landscape, and worried about getting more lost with little choice. Rosenthal took a turn in what he thought would intersect with the main trail, but unfortunately this only led him further away from the safe place he had hiked for almost 1.5 days. Walking 2,000 feet along the canyon before he ran out of all his food and water. Rosenthal knew his situation was dire, and he needed to find shelter. While he had never been in such a situation before, he knew that blindly hiking across the desert would only shorten his time before experiencing severe dehydration. He found a small ravine along the canyon, which provided a small area for shelter. He tried using his matches, but they failed to light up after trying to shout with his whistle for several hours. Rosenthal sat leaning against the canyon wall and waited. He would stay in the same place for another 4 days. Now, Rosenthal had been lost in the desert for a total of 5 full days, hungry, severely dehydrated, and losing hope during the days he spent sitting. On the side of the ravine, there were no signs of rescue in sight. Worried he wouldn't make it, Rosenthal took off his hat and pulled out a pen from his pocket on the edge of his hat. He wrote a message to his wife and daughter, telling them how much he loved them, and he didn't want his funeral to be sad. He wanted them to celebrate his life rather than mourn his death. He finished writing what he believed to be his final farewell message, then put his hat back on and rested his eyes. What Rosenthal didn't know was that on Saturday afternoon, at the same time he sat on the edge of the ravine, the hotel where he checked in realized he hadn't returned shortly after a camper at Black Rock Campground also noticed his car still at the trailhead. Authorities were alerted, and a search began on Sunday, 2 days after Rosenthal took the wrong turn. 60 rescue teams surveyed the area around the trail that Rosenthal was said to have taken. They used a helicopter, ground search team, and search dogs. On the third day, they found a series of tracks they believed to be Rosenthal's and followed them down the canyon until they reached the ravine where they lost the tracks. It was the same ravine where Rosenthal took the wrong turn, and right on the other side, Rosenthal wrote his farewell message on the edge of the ravine from his hat. The ground search team informed the helicopter air patrol, and on Thursday morning, Rosenthal was spotted by the helicopter sitting on the canyon wall, waving a shiny reflective cloth towards the pilot. Rosenthal was rescued after 6 days lost in the desert. He was treated at the nearest hospital and made a full recovery. Rosenthal's decision to stop walking and wait for rescue greatly contributed to his survival by conserving as much water and energy as possible. After returning home safely with his family, Rosenthal wrote one final entry in his hiking journal saying, "I'm still here." A few days before Halloween, I actually had a few days off, so after finishing work, I was hoping to stay up late and enjoy the night. I bought fast food on the way home and ate it on the couch while watching Netflix. About 30 minutes into the show, I paused and got up to throw away the unfinished food. I went into the kitchen and threw it away, but when I turned around, I saw someone standing in my backyard. They were just looking at my house without really doing anything. For context, my backyard is small but surrounded by a fence, so it's not possible for them to just stumble while taking a shortcut or something. I turned on the backyard porch light and opened the door. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled at them. With the porch light now on, I could see their face. They were still young, maybe in their early 20s, but their eyes looked very tired, and for lack of a better word, creepy. They didn't respond, so I called out again, "You need to leave, this is my property." The person looked at me, and then casually started walking towards the gate. I made sure they left by looking out the front window and watching them walk down the street. After they left, I just took a moment to think about what happened. It was very strange. Why would they even stand in my backyard to begin with? They were just staring at my house for no apparent reason. I even went as far as going out into the backyard and standing in the same spot as them to see what they could see, but there was actually nothing. I went back inside and tried to forget about it. I didn't know what to do. I poured myself a drink and sat back down to watch the show I was watching. I finished that episode and had just started the next one, so maybe it had been 20 minutes when I heard some soft footsteps running in my backyard, followed by a loud bang on my house. I stood up and ran to the kitchen to see the same person now standing at my back door. They were pushing their body against it and trying to forcefully open it. I grabbed the handle in case somehow they managed to get past the lock, but seeing the anger in their eyes up close was terrifying. I backed away and grabbed my phone while calling the police while standing in the kitchen and watching this person continue to try to get in. But then they suddenly stopped. They stared at me through the glass door, breathing heavily and still with a wild look in their eyes. Then they walked back to the gate, but this time they didn't leave. They stayed on the side of the house like they were hiding. I kept pacing back and forth from all the windows, waiting for the police to come, and hoping the person wouldn't try anything again. 5 minutes passed without any sound or movement before the police car arrived right on time. I heard footsteps running from the side of the house, but not away from the house. They ran back to the door trying to open it again. They chose to try to get in again, rather than take their chances running. Of course, the police managed to catch them when they tried to get in, and after a brief struggle, they handcuffed them and put them in the car. When questioned, it was very clear that the person was under the influence of something strong, and this was later confirmed with some tests. Although questioned that night and in the following days when they were sober, the man didn't give a real reason for his actions. I'm not sure how to feel about it. Part of me sees it as just a crazy person who has no reason, so why worry about it? But then part of me thinks about their gaze, and the fact that they tried to get in rather than run away means they must have had a reason. And somehow if they had managed to get in, what they would have tried to do to me is likely just as terrifying, reason or not. As far as I know, they were only jailed for a few weeks for being unconscious during their actions, so I can only worry if they intend to come back. This happened last fall, as we approached the end of the season nearing winter, and where I live, the weather can get very cold, sometimes even snowing in October. I've been doing food deliveries for the past 3 years and was working that night. It was around 1 in the morning and snow was lightly falling outside. It was one of the first snows, so people might be a bit hesitant to go out. I was one of the few cars out and about, but orders kept coming in almost immediately after I finished one order. After cruising around for almost until 1 a.m., I picked up one last order. The snow started to fall heavier and I began to feel a bit tired. I went through McDonald's where they ordered food and picked up the food, then set my direction towards the house. The place was nearby, about 10 minutes away, but I didn't consider the direction before accepting the order. It was opposite to my place, and I was already far, about 25 minutes from home, so it would be a long trip back. Irritated with myself, I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road. The snowplow truck still hadn't come out, maybe because they didn't expect as much snow. But my SUV usually handles well in the snow, so I wasn't too worried while driving. As I drove, I realized the road I was taking would lead me out of the main town area. I checked the map again, and indeed it said that was the route. But it was just a very unusual route. I didn't even know there were houses there because the only reason people take that road is to get to the highway leading out of the state. I drove for a few minutes, only seeing streetlights and trees until I reached the turnoff. It was a single narrow road branching off from the main road. I slowed down, becoming more cautious as this road was smaller and lined with trees, so it would be a very scary night if I slipped. As I drove down, I saw a few long driveways leading to a faint light amidst the trees far before I reached the driveway I was supposed to take. It looked like the others. I slowly drove past the driveway until I reached the house. The house was medium-sized and old, completely covered in snow. There was nothing particularly striking about it. The only intriguing thing was that the house was in the middle of the woods. I parked in front and grabbed the bag, then began to walk towards the door. The snow was thicker than I'd like, soaking my shoes and even the bottom of my pants. When I reached the porch, I knocked and began to put the bag down, but almost instantly the door opened. I looked up, seeing a big man in a winter jacket. His face was pale as if he had just been outside in the cold. "Hey, I have your order here," I said, lifting the bag. After a moment, the man stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can just leave it there," he said, raising his hand and pointing towards what I assumed was the kitchen. The way he said it made me feel like I should, but I knew it was a bad idea to go in there. I looked at the man's hand, seeing he wasn't holding anything, so it really didn't make sense for me to do anything other than give him the bag. "Sorry, but I really have to go," I said nervously while lifting the bag again. The man's face turned into a frown, then suddenly he slammed the door shut. Still holding the bag and slightly startled by what happened, I placed it on the porch and quickly began to walk back to my car. But as I passed the front yard, I heard something from behind me. I turned, realizing the sound was coming from somewhere else on the side of the house. It could have been the back door or something, but it was too faint to be heard clearly. Starting to feel uncomfortable, I walked faster and got into my car. I started the engine, and just as I looked up, I saw the man walking around the side of his house and quickly walking towards my car. He was holding something in his hand, almost looking like a rope, but there was something I couldn't see clearly. Suddenly, I felt my heartbeat spike and adrenaline take over my body. I started reversing, trying my best to go fast, while also not getting stuck in the snow. The man approached, maybe only a few feet from my car before my car gripped the road and began to gain speed. I backed out of the entire driveway, seeing the man finally stop and watch slowly fade into the darkness as I reversed onto the road. I didn't know what he was doing. Honestly, the whole thing was so scary and confusing that I didn't want to think about it. I still do food deliveries, but I'm much more cautious, and most of the time, I don't even knock on the door anymore. I just leave the food on the porch and go. If I had stayed any longer that night or gone inside the house, who knows what would have happened to me. This happened a few years ago in early October. I got a 2-week break from work and went to a cabin in the mountains outside my city. It was an Airbnb far from the hustle and bustle, which was perfect because I wanted to spend a few days camping as well. I drove for 2 hours to the cabin and arrived there in the late afternoon. The place was very nice and secluded. No other cabins or buildings in sight, just the surrounding forest. I unpacked my stuff inside and explored the rooms, but there was nothing special. The cabin felt very cozy with a classic old-timey vibe. Not something I particularly liked, but it was a nice change for a holiday environment. The rest of the night and the next few days passed without anything noteworthy. I spent my time relaxing outside in the cool autumn weather for most of the day, and spent the nights inside the house sitting by the fireplace. However, on the 5th day, I decided to go camping with my camping gear. I wasn't sure how long I would be camping, but planned for 2 to 3 nights. There were some trails nearby that I knew from previous planning, but only one of them actually connected to the cabin. To keep things simple, I chose to only take that trail so I could leave the cabin directly without having to drive anywhere. I walked for at least 3 or 4 hours before finding a spot I liked. It was the only open spot I found besides the trail itself. But there was something unsettling about camping right on the trail. It was getting close to nighttime, so I set up my tent and made a fire. As it got darker, I put on a thick sweater and jacket because the air was starting to get very cold. I sat outside by the fire for about an hour, eating fast food and waiting for sleepiness to kick in. However, at some point while I was sitting there, my eyes caught something. A figure walking out of the woods. I saw them walking in the darkness without a flashlight or anything, and disappearing into the distance. The only light in the woods was my campfire besides the dim moonlight, so whoever was out there must have seen me. It was so strange the way they walked, just out there in the woods without any light and not even following the trail. It made me feel very uncomfortable. Enough to consider going back to the cabin, but I knew it wasn't safe to go out so late at night. I remained vigilant for half an hour, checking everywhere but not seeing any other signs of the person. After a while, I started to feel sleepy, so I flattened the fire and let it die out. But as the fire's glow faded into ashes, I heard footsteps coming from the left side of the campsite. My eyes widened as I looked towards the woods and tried to force my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but all I could see were a few feet in front. The footsteps grew louder as they approached the campsite, getting closer to me until I thought they must be out of my sight. But then they walked a little to the side, still in the darkness and passing by, then continued walking away. They never stopped or did anything to indicate they were aware of my presence, but the possibility of them being out there in the same spot as me was too unlikely to be a coincidence. After the footsteps disappeared, I grabbed my flashlight and packed up my tent, gathered my belongings, and went back to the trail. It wasn't an ideal choice, but I could sense that there was something strange about whatever was happening. I walked quickly, keeping my flashlight on the trail and trying to stay calm. The forest was so quiet, only adding to the eerie situation I was experiencing. Though hesitant, I managed to make it back to the cabin. It was still late at night, and after walking so far that day without sleep, I immediately fell asleep on the couch just minutes after getting inside. My mind was so foggy that I didn't even really think about the person in the woods anymore. Being within a 4-hour walking distance from where I saw them, I didn't feel like I had a reason to be afraid anymore. However, as I drifted into sleep, I woke up to a strange sound. Something on the side of the cabin like wood being slid against the wall. My eyes widened, and I turned my head towards the back of the room, seeing the window slowly being opened by a man outside. His eyes immediately shifted towards me as I stood up. Then he closed the window and fled. As I rushed towards where he was already far into the woods. I gathered everything and left the cabin, driving to a hotel in the nearest town. Clearly, I didn't know who the man was or what he was doing there. Clearly, he was following me and trying to get into the cabin while I slept. If he had succeeded, there's no telling what would have happened. There is a serious weakness in the Airbnb system if someone is hosting guests for the first time. How can one know what they will do? Some people who first stayed with them place great trust in someone untested. I'm sure 99% of the time everything is perfectly fine, but in my own experience, that 1% nearly got me killed. It left me deeply traumatized. It was my first time using Airbnb. I was going back to my hometown, but none of my friends had a place for me to stay with them, and I didn't really have a relationship with my family, which made staying with them a very viable option because there aren't many good hotels in a small town like mine, and Airbnb seemed like the only good option. I didn't mind because of their lack of ratings for the place I chose, and how the host had just joined the platform a week ago. I didn't really think it was important. He was just an ordinary-looking man, a middle-aged family man who was bald and had enough money to own 2 properties when I got there. I realized it was much smaller than it initially seemed, just 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. The larger of the 2 bedrooms was the one I was supposed to stay in, at the back of the house with a window facing inwards. In the backyard, the host had talked to me a few moments earlier, leaving me feeling strange, even looking back, knowing all I know now at first. It was really simple from what kind of person he actually was. Besides, I went out with my friends on the first night, and I came back late and drunk. I immediately fell into bed. Woke up in the afternoon feeling groggy. Pulled myself out of bed to get up and use the bathroom. But when I tried to open the bedroom door, it was locked. I turned the key the other way, but it made no difference. Still wouldn't open. I felt suffocated, but I still couldn't believe it was actually locked from the other side. How could that even be? I walked to the bedside table to grab my phone, but it wasn't there. I knew I left it charging there next to the bed, but it wasn't there. My mind really started racing. Maybe I left my phone in the luggage, I thought. But again, I was baffled when I searched my bag in the closet, and none of them were there. Panic and confusion started to set in. I started pacing around the room, just looking around at the sheets and all the shelves and decorations. But the more I looked, the clearer it became to me that none of my belongings were in the room. I sat on the bed to try. And make me nervous, I felt choked in the room and confused about what to do. I was also still blurry because of the hangover, and I was dehydrated with a splitting headache, and because I couldn't get out of the room to get anything, water. I thought of opening the window and letting fresh air in, and then if I couldn't think of anything else, I would just climb out. But what scared me was the window facing the backyard yesterday is now closed. My heart was truly sinking, and I suddenly wanted to vomit this can. I thought everything had reached boiling point, and I immediately ran towards the door. I tried to smash it while screaming bloody murder for the host to come. Let me out. Then what surprised me? The door opened, but its exit swung so fast it hit my face and made me fall back. And here comes the host with a rifle aimed directly at me to stare into his eyes and the tone of his voice. Everything about him was completely different. He had a strange smile on his face like a true serial killer. And everything he said to me then I had to remember. So you finally wake up, you so out of there last night. You made it easy for me to come and set up to your room for what I planned with you. Hey buddy, let me go, you sick kid. I yelled back just for him to aim the rifle at my face. He just told me to shut up if I didn't want to make things worse for myself. I then added the door opened behind him, seriously, considering trying to make a break and get through it, but he looked where I looked. I wouldn't try it if I were you, he said. The whole house is locked up for you, and I'll spend a lot of time here with you. Sicko just laughed and smiled. I didn't care to escape just like that. I've wanted to do something like this for as long as I can remember. I'll destroy you, he said. You will suffer and suffer, and you will beg me to release you first. You will be angry. You will threaten me. Then you will say you will do whatever I want when it won't work, when your soul is truly shattered because of everything I planned to put you through. You will beg for the sweet release of death then, and only then will I finally kill you after that. I'm not sure how much longer I'll do it, laughing at your torn up corpse, but in the end, I think I'll commit suicide too. I don't intend to continue this life in prison. Everything he said hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt dizzy and I had to sit down. It made my host tickle. It's all settled now, isn't it? He said with a smile. There's no way out of this for you. I struggled even to look at him, but I had to ask, don't you have family or someone to keep your face turned sour when I mention family? Clearly they're gone, he said. But you have. That's what will make this whole process enjoyable for me, watching you give in to all my friends who are still wondering where I am, I said politely, finding the courage to say they'll come looking for me, yes. And I'll know when they send you a message that our time is up, he replied. At the exact moment when you think you'll be saved. You'll actually be damned, isn't that a beautiful twist of fate? He said. I fell silent. I still didn't understand what was happening. I even almost didn't hear what he said next. A moment later, he caught me off guard with the handle of his gun hitting my face. I didn't faint, but I was so dizzy that I fell to the floor, and from there he continued to hit me and kick me into. Just after he ran out of breath, he left the room and locked me in again, spending the next eternity trapped in that room. While I didn't know if anyone came to help me every few hours, he would come back in and torture me. Beaten, choked, cut, and raped relentlessly repeatedly for 4 days, legs and arms broken so I couldn't move or fight. I experienced internal and external bleeding, and as he said would happen, my mind was truly shattered to the point where I almost hoped he would eventually kill me. But I forgot that I told my friends where I lived, and after I didn't come out to meet them for a few days, they went looking for me. But unlike what people said the sick man would do, he squeezed out every last second, torturing me as much as he could. And when the police stormed his house, He blew his own brains out and left me alive. But once again, I truly wished he hadn't. My husband and I often travel, and we are increasingly choosing to stay in Airbnb rather than hotels. It's homier, more unique, and provides a more personal experience that we used to enjoy, because instead of checking in with a soulless front desk clerk, you actually get to chat with the host as a human. But our last stay at Airbnb will likely be our last for us. My husband and I have stayed at a particular Airbnb on 2 other occasions, and we absolutely loved it. The decor was very cozy and suited for a romantic adventure. I think we booked this Airbnb, which was a half duplex, when we went to San Francisco to visit our old friends who live in a very fun community outside the Bay Area. He spent a lot of time with those friends, but we were glad to have a place for us to spend time alone that didn't feel like a typical boring hotel room. We started to befriend the host as well. He's a single man around 35 years old who lives alone with his cat. My husband and I always noticed how enthusiastic he was about welcoming us. He would invite us to the side of his house for breakfast every morning, which we usually accepted because he turned out to be a good cook. It felt kind of weird to sit and eat with him, although sometimes he would ask a lot of questions, most of which weren't too weird, but some were personal. Like he would ask us how long we've been married. Then he would ask us if he planned to make any children, emphasizing that he only brought it up like in making children. Then you would ask if we had ever practiced the teachings of the Kama Sutra, if you want tips or advice, or even help change the situation in the bedroom. And at that time my husband would finally silence him with some firm words. He experienced such awkward silence, at least once every time we ate with the host. But we suffered because of it, because it was worth the delicious free food every time the situation became tense. I would try to lighten the mood with jokes. One time the host pressed us about our fertility in the bedroom. I tried to proudly state that we've mastered all the basics to our liking. I hoped it would be a funny end to the subject, but it backfired. He started laughing hysterically, like too intensely he even had trouble speaking, but he did it again. Came out something that sounded like, "Oh, I know you're doing a privacy violation." Suggestion really pissed off my husband, who stood up from his seat very abruptly and shouted at the host, demanding him to explain exactly what he meant. The host immediately stopped laughing and started spinning for a few seconds before finally admitting that he had heard us having sex through the wall one night. My husband and I could be loud enough, so we were somewhat forced to do it. Except this explanation that it all happened the second time we stayed. The third time we flew out to meet our friends. We discussed where we wanted to stay, and my husband brought up all the weird things the host would say, and suggested we leave elsewhere. Unfortunately, we searched for other options, and there were none that were high quality, affordable, and in the right location. So he settled in just a few minutes after making the reservation. The host sent us an SMS through the Airbnb app, and he stated an excessive amount of excitement, saying that he loved us, and that he was very happy we chose to stay with him again. He rolled his eyes and said, "Here he goes again." But at that time, it was still a little funny when we arrived. The host tried to wait on our hands and feet, but we arrived late because our flight was delayed. So we were very tired, and we asked to be left alone for the night. The host looked sad about this for a moment, but then when he walked away, he couldn't. I wanted to let this telltale smile appear on his face. The husband didn't see it, but I did. I was going to mention it to him, but my attention was diverted by something when he walked into the bedroom. We immediately realized that it was a smile. Different somehow. Everything has been rearranged since the last time we were there. We talked about it for a few minutes, but I didn't think too much about it. And neither did my husband. You might fall asleep in a few minutes if we hadn't noticed after getting into bed that we hadn't done it. Making love for a few days because just thinking about it and returning to the room, we were already in the mood. I won't explain it in detail, but long story short, there's a lamp on the bedside table that didn't light up. It wasn't there before, and because we weren't used to it there, and our excitement, we dropped it. Everything shattered when it touched the floor, causing us to stop what we were doing to clean up the mess. But my husband found something in the pile of broken ceramics. Something that looked like a button just a few seconds ago, a spy camera. My reaction felt like I was about to vomit, but I had never seen my husband's face reddened with such intense anger so quickly. He dressed and rushed out of the room, then burst through the door into the host on the side of the house and barged into his bedroom. I didn't follow, but I listened to my husband threaten to kill him if he didn't explain himself. After that, there was a prolonged, heated interrogation. I can't explain everything, but from what my husband told me, he made the host confess through many crocodile tears that he had been spying on us in the bedroom all along, and that he had just installed an additional camera when he knew we were coming again. We tried to get him to delete all the recordings, but the worst part is it was already too late because the host was a very weird and creepy guy. He posted the recordings. He had to several porn sites, which basically means there's no way to know how many people have seen us in our private time. Together, practically impossible for me to completely erase that recording from existence if someone else has downloaded it. Of course, this ordeal was more devastating than just our vacation with friends, and we're just at the beginning of pressing charges, if not. I'll be more open to revealing every little detail related to him as a way to get revenge, but I'd rather see him rot in jail, so I'll do it the right way and keep it secret. I used to rent out my garage apartment as an Airbnb. I've never had any major issues, so I never checked the bookings carefully before accepting them. But if I decide to host guests on Airbnb again, it'll be something I'll change about how I do things. I'm sure it's only a matter of time before I have an experience with a guest who's really crazy and truly disruptive. So I'll have to stop hosting guests, so I don't have to deal with something like that again. Again, the guest in question is this person. I'll do it, called Kyle. He's a single guy in his early 30s who wanted to stay for a week. He didn't mention that he was traveling or anything, he just said he really needed a somewhat unusual place to stay. But I didn't do it. I didn't think too much about it when I met him for check-in. He didn't have a lot of stuff, just a backpack, a duffel bag, and a broken bike. I could tell just by looking at him that he was in a tough spot. Maybe even homeless, which made me wonder how he was paying the fees. It seemed like he hadn't bathed or taken care of himself in weeks, and overall his demeanor was quite restless. But at the time, he wasn't rude at all. He was actually quite friendly and appreciative, even though he's like this. I didn't treat him differently after I gave him the usual tour. I left him alone, and I told him to mind his own business, like I would tell anyone else. Unfortunately, as time went by, I slowly realized that Kyle would be trouble. I could hear booming music from inside constantly, and no matter how many times I messaged him to turn it down, he never did when I knocked on the door to tell him directly. I would see his shadow moving inside and hear him frantically rummaging things like he was trying to hide something, but he wouldn't answer. I debated about entering with my own key, but I decided not to. It really started to make me uneasy more than anything, because I had never done that before. The biggest red flag that I should have taken more seriously was the smell coming from the door. It felt like burning plastic or something. At the time, I didn't know what the smell was coming from, but afterwards it became very clear what he was doing in there and what caused it. I should have kicked him out sooner, but after a few days I thought I would let him stay until the end of his booking, because the distance wasn't too far after he was there for a week. It was finally time for the guest to usually leave, just like that when it's time to check out, and I'm grateful I didn't have to interact with him again. I'm also glad that the annoying music finally stopped, but I'm nervous to go in and see what kind of mess he made. I have to go in and check because I'm the one who will clean it up, and let me just say I was shocked the whole place was trashed. All the furniture had been moved. There was trash everywhere. Food supplies were on every kitchen surface, and one of the pots was completely destroyed because it was coated in a white substance that I couldn't identify for my life. The entire apartment also smelled just as bad as the garage did. I tore myself to go to the bathroom with an odd feeling when I got there. The door was locked frustratingly. I went briefly to get into my house and grab a hairpin so I could unlock the door. But when I returned, the bathroom door was open. A cold breeze creeping down my spine, and I suddenly felt very uneasy. Then I heard a sound from the kitchen that made my heart sink. The glass broke. I crept down the hallway and stopped in the corner and slowly peeked around only to see Kyle standing there with a broken bottle in one hand and a metal baseball bat in the other. When I stared into his eyes, I knew he was twisted on something, and seeing me caused him to go ballistic and start yelling at me. "Who are you? Get out of my house! Don't mess with me! I swear to God I'll kill you!" I started backing towards the door, avoiding sudden movements while I tried to explain myself. "Kyle, I'm the host. I let you stay here, remember?" I didn't remember. "You don't try to fool me." He said, "I'm not lying to you. I swear. Look, come on. Let's talk about this. Can you put all that? You just started screaming at me after that, repeatedly telling me to shut up. Then Kyle suddenly attacked me, turning around and running out the door, but before I was clear in the turn, I felt a glass bottle hit my back and shatter and hurt me badly. I kept running until I could get away safely. I got back into my car. House and I locked the door from there. I called the police. I'm sure the standoff between Kyle and the police is also another story, but unfortunately, I missed most of what I saw was just them leaving with 4 or 5 officers and coming out with Kyle's hands and legs bound double in shackles and screaming bloody murder when I found out Kyle was smoking the whole time he was staying in my garage apartment. And he finally got so upset that he forgot he was just a guest. He should have left after a week after that. There was always a feeling of unease in my mouth every time I thought about it letting another stranger stay on my property, so I canceled all my bookings and deleted my account. I guess I'll never try my luck again.